We learn best through stories. So I have a story to share. I would like to introduce you to Joe Guest. He could be any guest visiting Family House. In this situation, I want you to envision a middle aged man and woman. You can close your eyes, envision that you are Mr. or Mrs. Guest. Later, we'll take a closer look at their experience. Joe got some bad news from his doctor. His tumor that they had been monitoring for the past few years has grown to become a concern. Unfortunately, she can't manage the next step and referred Joe to a specialized oncologist down in Pittsburgh, about 4 hours from home. His doctor told him to plan on a few more tests when he arrives, and that it would probably take a couple of days to determine the next steps in his treatment. Joe called his wife, not frantic, but a little down. She took charge, building Joe up. We're going to beat this. After talking to some nice people at the hospital in Pittsburgh, they suggested that they could stay at a place called Family House, since they might need to stay nearby for a few days. Mrs. Guest looked online and decided to call to make a reservation. The person on the phone was very nice. She said she could guarantee a room and she gave her credit card information. The next week, Mr. and Mrs. Guest jumped into their 2006 Chevy and made their way to the city. Mr. Guest had been to Pittsburgh before, but it was a few years ago. Mrs. Guest had never been there. Normally, Mr. Guest would drive, but today he wasn't feeling too well, so Mrs. Guest decided to drive. The trip wasn't too bad. The GPS got them onto the parkway, and they arrived at 233 McKee Place without any incident. Odd, there was no building. It was just a green lawn. Mrs. Guest called the number in her phone. It was late on a Sunday night, and after a slight delay, a kind voice answered. Thank you for calling Family House. This is Kara. How may I help you? Mrs. Guest said, We can't find the house. The woman answered, You've reached the answering service. Do you know which location you have a reservation? Mrs. Guest said she did not know. The woman asked for her name and asked Mrs. Guest to hold the line. After a brief delay, the woman said, I see you on the list for University Place. Mrs. Guest said, Well, where is that? The woman said, 116 Thackeray Avenue. Mrs. Guest asked, How far is that from where we are? The woman said, Oh, just a few blocks, I think. Please call back when you arrive at University Place so we can contact the manager to let you in. Please call me if you need any other assistance. I can stay on the line if you would like. That's okay, thank you, replied Mrs. Guest. It seemed to take forever to go a few blocks, but they found 116 Thackeray Avenue. It looked a little funny until they noticed the sign that said Family House. They parked in an open spot, unloaded their luggage, and entered the lobby. It smelled a little smoky, but they overlooked that. They were just tired and needed a place to stay. They tried the inside door, but it wouldn't open. Forgetting they were supposed to call back when they arrived, they looked around and found a box with some buttons that said to press them to check in. They pressed the one that said press to check in. Nothing happened. They pressed again. Still nothing. They pressed the other button that said press to reach the manager. Nothing happened. Frustration moved to annoyance. Mrs. Guest called the number again. The woman answered and said, Just a minute and someone will be right with you. It was getting pretty late and well past their normal bedtime. A couple of minutes later, a nice young man greeted them. Welcome to Family House, Mr. and Mrs. Guest. I'm Frank. I'm so sorry about the difficulty you had finding us. He invited them to join him on the elevator to the 8th floor and to have a seat while he got their key. He spent a few moments on the computer and then came out with a piece of paper that Mr. and Mrs. Guest needed to sign. They were too tired to read it, so just signed it and gave it back. Frank asked how they would like to pay for their stay. They said to just charge the credit card that they gave when they called. He did so, but it didn't work. He asked for the actual credit card. Mr. Guest retrieved it from his wallet and gave it to him. He swiped the card and got a note saying unauthorized purchase. So Frank asked for a different card. Mr. Guest said he had an American Express card. Frank said he couldn't take that. Mrs. Guest happened to remember that she had her checkbook and asked if she could pay by check, and she did. Frank asked if they had ever been to Family House before. No, we haven't even been to Pittsburgh before. After some small talk, he began telling them all about how to use the kitchen, that they couldn't smoke or bring alcohol on the property, how they missed tonight's dinner and the regular volunteer that helps check guests into their room. He showed them where the coffee would be in the morning, along with the rules on the refrigerator basket and the dry storage if they wanted to use them. After what seemed to take forever, Frank offered to escort Mr. and Mrs. Guest to their room. They went to the fifth floor on the elevator. They walked the long hallway back to room 520. When Mr. and Mrs. Guest walked in, the room was dark. It smelled okay. Frank said, "If you need anything, the office opens at 7." Exhausted from their very long evening, they laid down. There were two twin beds. They thought they were going to have at least one queen size bed, but they'll take what they can get right now. We'll ask to be moved in the morning. Mr. Guest decided to take a shower before turning in since his appointment was early in the morning. He turned on the light in the bathroom and noticed that there weren't any towels. He went to pick up the phone to call the front desk. It wasn't a phone. He asked Mrs. Guest to call again, and the woman who answered apologized and said she would contact the resident manager. After a few minutes, Frank called Mrs. Guest back and informed her that there are spare linens on the 8th floor in the cabinet. Mrs. Guest asked for the house phone number and then retrieved some towels and washcloths. Mr. Guest's shower was a little cool, but he felt clean and wanted to get a good night's sleep. Mr. and Mrs. Guest woke up early to get to Mr. Guest's appointment. They discovered that their car wasn't in the parking lot. Frantic, they called the house number. She got the answering service again. After a few more minutes, Frank called her back. Mrs. Guest was still very upset. He asked her to calm down and informed her that the parking lot was the university's lot and the guests can only park in the designated family house spaces. A little too late for that, said Mrs. Guest. Not wanting to be late for the appointment, they decided to deal with it later. How do we get to the hospital from here? Frank told them that they just missed the 6 o'clock shuttle, and the next shuttle leaves the house at 6:45 and arrives at the hospital at 7:03. That's too late, said Mrs. Guest. Our appointment is at 6:30. Frank told him that he could try to request an Uber, but wasn't sure they would be available this early. He told them that the hospital is only a few blocks away and that they could walk if they didn't want to wait for an Uber. They walked. They arrived at the hospital, took the escalator, made it up their way up to the doctor's office a few minutes after 6:30. The nurse took Mr. Guest's blood pressure. Any idea what it was? Now, as you might have guessed, this is a fictional story. However, every example in this story has been experienced by a guest. Hopefully not the same guest. A little bit later, we're going to come back to this story and ask what went right and what went wrong. But before we do that, I would like to introduce you to our guest services cycle.